There is a moment when a cobra rises from the dust and spreads its hood in the Kalahari sun, where every small creature within 30 meters should, by every law of survival, simply run. The snake is 3 feet long. Its venom is hemotoxic and neurotoxic simultaneously. One full bite delivered to something the size of a meerkat would be lethal within minutes. And yet what happens next, when a mob of meerkats encounters that cobra, is not a retreat. It is not panic. It is not chaos. What happens is something so precise, so coordinated, so governed by invisible rules and ancient social contracts, that it looks less like an animal encounter and more like a military operation being executed by creatures who have been rehearsing it their entire lives. Which, in a way, they have. If you want to see more about the hidden architecture of animal societies, about the rules and roles and relationships that govern the wild in ways most of us never consider, then subscribe now. What we are going to explore today goes far deeper than a dramatic snake standoff. It goes into the very structure of meerkat society itself, into how these animals have built a system of cooperation so robust, so layered, so redundant in its design, that even under the most extreme pressure it does not break. The Kalahari Desert is not, despite how it sometimes appears in photographs, a dead place. It is a living, heaving, hostile world that tests everything within it every single hour of every single day. The temperatures swing between extremes that would kill most animals in hours. The ground is hard, red, compacted iron oxide sand that reflects heat upward in waves that make the air above it shimmer like a mirage. Rainfall is unpredictable, sometimes entirely absent for months. Predators arrive from above and below in all directions, from martial eagles that can spot a meerkat from 2 kilometers in the air, to Cape cobras and puff adders that move silently through the dry grass, to jackals and honey badgers that are capable of digging through earth. And yet in this landscape, the meerkat thrives, not despite its small size, which peaks at about a kilogram for a large adult, but in significant part because of what it has built around itself. A society, a functional, role-based, deeply coordinated society that operates like a single organism made of many small bodies. Understanding what happens during a cobra encounter requires understanding the architecture of that society first, because the cobra response is not an isolated behavior. It is one expression of a system that runs continuously, invisibly, through every hour of every meerkat day. It is the same system that gets them out of the burrow at dawn, that keeps them fed, that raises their young, that defends their territory, and that, when a cobra appears, deploys the right animals into the right positions, with the right behaviors, almost without apparent instruction. Meerkats live in groups called mobs, or gangs. The size of these mobs varies considerably, from as few as 3 or 4 individuals in a newly established group to as many as 30 or 40 in a large established mob with multiple breeding seasons behind it. The typical mob you would encounter in the central Kalahari runs somewhere between 10 and 25 members. Within that mob, every individual occupies a position that is defined partly by age, partly by sex, partly by kinship, partly by experience, and partly by a dominance hierarchy that is strict at the top and more fluid further down. At the top of that hierarchy sits the dominant female. And this is important to understand. In meerkat society, the dominant position is held by a female, not a male. This is unusual among mammals, which tend overwhelmingly toward male-dominated hierarchies, and it shapes everything about how the group functions. The dominant female is typically the oldest and most experienced female in the group. She is the primary and often the only breeding female. She mates preferentially with the dominant male, though she is not entirely monogamous, and she produces the vast majority of the pups that the mob raises. In a large, stable mob, she may produce 4 litters per year, with an average of 3 pups per litter. Her reproductive output is the engine of the group's growth, but her role goes far beyond reproduction. She makes the decisions about when the mob moves, where it forages, when it retreats to the burrow, and how the group responds to threats. She is the anchor of the entire social structure. Her presence is what holds the mob together. Research in the Kalahari has shown that when a dominant female dies or disappears, the resulting social disruption can be catastrophic. Mobs fragment, subordinate females compete violently for dominance, and in the chaos, pup survival rates plummet. The dominant female's authority is not just social convention, it is structural necessity. Beneath the dominant female, the dominant male holds the second position in the hierarchy. His role is complex. He contributes to pup rearing, participates in sentinel duty, helps defend the territory against rival mobs, and mates with the dominant female. But he is also expendable in a way the dominant female is not, because if he is lost, another male from outside the group, a rover who has been trying to infiltrate for weeks or months, can step in relatively quickly. Losing the dominant female has no such easy solution. The experience and social connections she carries cannot be transferred in a day. Below the dominant pair are the subordinate adults, the sub-adults, the juveniles, and the pups. Each of these categories carries different role assignments, and those assignments shift as animals age and develop. A pup born this season will be foraging independently within 3 months, will be contributing to sentinel duty within 4 or 5 months, and will be taking on more complex roles, including helping to raise the next litter within its first year. The progression is not random. It is tracked and calibrated by the group, and animals that do not progress on schedule, through illness or developmental delay, are sidelined from the more demanding roles accordingly. This brings us to the sentinel system, which is perhaps the most important piece of infrastructure in the entire meerkat social architecture, and the piece most directly relevant to what happens during a Cobra encounter. Understanding sentinels properly, not just the basic idea that one meerkat watches while others forage, but the full mechanistic detail of how sentinel duty works, is essential to understanding how the Cobra response is possible. Every meerkat mob has, at almost any given moment during daylight hours, at least one individual elevated above the group and scanning for threats. This is the sentinel. The sentinel climbs to the highest available point, which in the Kalahari might be a termite mound, a dead log, a thorn bush, the topmost branch of a shepherd's tree, or, in the absence of anything else, simply an elevated patch of ground that provides an extra half-meter of sightline. Once positioned, the sentinel enters a state of heightened alertness that is measurably distinct from ordinary wakefulness. Its head moves in regular scanning arcs, sweeping the sky and the surrounding ground in a pattern that maximizes coverage while minimizing the chance of missing movement in any sector. And while scanning, the sentinel vocalizes. This is the element that makes the system extraordinary. The meerkat sentinel does not simply call when it sees a threat. It calls continuously while it is on duty, producing a soft, repetitive sound that researchers describe as a watchman's song. This song tells the foraging mob two things simultaneously. First, it signals that a sentinel is on duty and that the information channel is open. Second, it signals that the sentinel has not yet detected a threat. As long as the song continues, the mob can forage with relative confidence. The moment it stops, something has changed. The watchman's song has been studied extensively by researchers at Cambridge and the Kalahari Meerkat Project, which has been running continuously since 1993 and represents one of the longest-running studies of wild animal behavior in Africa. What those researchers found is that the song functions as a real-time status broadcast. Foraging meerkats that can hear the song increase their foraging efficiency significantly, taking longer, more effective digs, moving more deliberately, spending less time scanning themselves. When the song stops, the foraging animals immediately increase their own vigilance, even before any alarm call is given. They are, in effect, monitoring a live information stream and adjusting their behavior in real time based on changes in that stream. The sentinel position is not held by the same individual for extended periods. Typically, an animal will hold sentinel duty for between 5 and 15 minutes before another individual takes over. The transition is not random. It is initiated by the incoming sentinel, who approaches the elevated position and takes it over, while the previous sentinel descends and rejoins the foraging group. In well-functioning mobs, this handover happens seamlessly, with almost no gap in coverage. In mobs under stress, where individuals are ill, hungry, or depleted in number, the handovers become less smooth, the gaps in coverage grow, and the mob's vulnerability increases correspondingly. What determines who serves as sentinel? This is where the role system becomes particularly intricate. Sentinel duty is not shared equally among all mob members. Dominant animals tend to spend more time on sentinel duty than subordinates, which seems counterintuitive, but reflects the fact that dominant animals are better foragers who can afford to take time away from feeding. Individuals who have fed well in the morning are more likely to take sentinel duty in the afternoon. Animals who are ill or injured reduce their sentinel contribution significantly, which makes sense from an individual fitness perspective, but creates a systemic vulnerability that the mob must compensate for. And animals of certain ages and experience levels are more effective sentinels than others. Young animals on sentinel duty are more likely to miss threats, more likely to give false alarms, and more likely to abandon their post prematurely. Experienced sentinels are better at everything. The alarm calls themselves carry a staggering amount of information. Meerkats do not have a single alarm call. They have a vocabulary of alarm calls that vary along multiple dimensions simultaneously. The call varies in urgency, in pitch, in repetition rate, and in whether it is a short, sharp burst or a sustained call. And each of these variations carries specific meaning that the mob can decode and act on in real time. There are calls that mean aerial predator, high urgency, take cover immediately. There are calls that mean terrestrial predator, unknown distance, assess and prepare. There are calls that mean snake, confirmed snake, specific response required. And there are variants within each of these categories that communicate additional information about the size of the threat, the confidence of the caller, and the proximity of the danger. This alarm call system was analyzed in detail by researcher Marta Manser and her colleagues, who found that Meerkat alarm calls encode what is effectively referential information, meaning the calls refer to specific categories of threat in the external world, not just to the caller's internal emotional state. This is a distinction that matters enormously in animal communication research, and it places meerkats in a small group of animals, including vervet monkeys, prairie dogs, and a handful of bird species who have been shown to have calls that function as true referential signals. The mob members respond differently to different calls, not because they are more or less frightened in a vague sense, but because they are receiving specific information about what kind of threat is present and what response that threat requires. Now we can begin to understand the cobra encounter properly. When a Cape cobra enters the territory of a meerkat mob, the first thing that happens is detection, and that detection almost always comes from the sentinel. The cobra moves through the grass using a combination of sight and scent to hunt for lizards, small mammals, and bird eggs. It does not announce itself. It moves with the fluid, unhurried efficiency of an animal that depends on stealth for survival. But in a mob with an active sentinel on a 2-meter termite mound, the cobra's movement through the grass is visible long before it is close enough to pose an immediate threat. The sentinel's alarm call is immediate and specific. The snake call is distinct from both the aerial predator call and the general terrestrial predator call. It has a quality, a specific cadence and pitch combination that the mob recognizes instantly and responds to with a behavior that is unlike either the dive for cover response to aerial threats or the freeze and assess response to distant terrestrial threats. The snake call triggers an approach, not a retreat, not a freeze, but a movement toward the threat. This is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of meerkat behavior, and it is the aspect that most reveals the sophistication of their role-based coordination. The approach begins with the mob members nearest the sentinel, moving toward the area where the snake has been spotted. The dominant animals typically lead this approach, followed by experienced subadults. Juveniles and pups hang back. This is not random. The animals moving forward are those with the most snake encounter experience, the best assessment of their own physical capabilities, and the most information about the mob's overall tactical situation. The animals hanging back are those whose value in the approach is lowest and whose risk of being lost is highest. A pup killed by a cobra is a catastrophe, not just emotionally but economically, in terms of the mob's future reproductive capacity. An experienced 4-year-old adult killed by a cobra is a loss, but a recoverable one. As the mob converges on the cobra's position, something remarkable happens to the animal's physical presentation. They arch their backs, they raise their tails, they puff out their hair to maximize their apparent size. They move in a group that is tight enough to create a visual impression of a single large organism rather than multiple small ones. They are performing threat inflation, making themselves look collectively like something the cobra should be worried about. And the cobra is worried about it. A Cape cobra faced with a coordinated group of 15 meerkats presenting in this way is facing a threat it did not expect and does not have a clean response to. Its instinct is to find an escape route, but the meerkat's positioning is deliberately cutting off those routes. The vocal element of this encounter is extraordinary. The mob begins what researchers call a recruitment call sequence, a rapid succession of vocalizations that escalate in intensity and draw in any mob members who are farther afield, foraging at the edges of the group's range. Meerkats who were 200 meters away digging for beetles 10 minutes ago are now sprinting back toward the group, recruited by the call sequence into a confrontation they didn't witness beginning. When they arrive, they join the back of the mob formation, adding to the visual mass and the acoustic pressure on the Cobra. The Cobra, meanwhile, is doing what Cobras do under threat. It rises. It spreads its hood. It presents the intimidating display that has worked against virtually every other predator it has ever encountered. The hood of a Cape Cobra, spread fully, is a genuinely alarming thing to see from ground level. The snake is taller than the meerkats by a significant margin when in strike posture, and its strike is fast, its reach is considerable, and its venom is immediately dangerous. A full envenomation would kill an adult meerkat. There is no ambiguity about that. The meerkats know this in the way that only animals who have evolved alongside a predator for millions of years can know it. They know what this snake is, and yet they do not back off. What they do instead is manage the range. They keep themselves at a distance from the Cobra that is just barely outside its reliable strike zone. The average strike distance of a Cape Cobra is roughly 1/3 of its body length. The meerkats, drawing on experience that is both individual and culturally transmitted through the group, maintain a standoff distance that respects this strike range while keeping pressure on the snake. They are not being reckless. They are being precisely calibrated in their risk management. Within the mob formation, roles are active and shifting. The dominant female is typically in the center front of the group, where her vocalizations have the greatest effect on group cohesion, and where she can monitor both the snake and the behavior of her mob members. The dominant male is often to her side, slightly forward, making him one of the animals closest to the actual threat. This is partly a display of dominance, partly a function of his physical capability, and partly an expression of the division of defensive roles that the group's social structure enforces. Meanwhile, back from the confrontation line, at least one animal has maintained sentinel duty on a high point. This is crucial and easily overlooked. While the Cobra is the threat everyone can see, the Kalahari never offers only one threat at a time. The sound of a mob in confrontation is audible for several hundred meters and is attractive to jackals, which have learned that confronting meerkats sometimes means an opportunity for predation. A martial eagle overheard 2 kilometers away may swing closer to investigate the commotion. The sentinel maintained during the Cobra confrontation is not just performing a procedural role because that is what sentinels do. It is performing an active and necessary function because the Cobra confrontation creates a specific vulnerability to secondary predators, and the role system compensates for that vulnerability automatically. The confrontation can last for a surprisingly long time. These standoffs between meerkats and cobras are not brief, dramatic moments. They can persist for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, in some documented cases over an hour. During this time, the cobra is under constant pressure. It cannot hunt. It cannot move in any direction without the mob adjusting its formation. It is being harassed, not attacked, because the meerkats are playing a specific strategy. They are not trying to kill the cobra. They are trying to exhaust it, to make remaining in the area more energetically costly than leaving, to outcompete it for space through sustained, coordinated pressure that individually none of them could maintain, but collectively they can sustain indefinitely. The mob members rotate their positions during this standoff. Animals that have been at the front of the confrontation line, holding the most demanding and stressful position, step back and are replaced by others who have been resting slightly farther from the snake. This rotation is spontaneous and yet organized, another expression of the role system operating without explicit direction. No animal directs another to move up or step back. The system coordinates itself through the responses of individuals who each know their own state, their own capacity, and their own position in the group's social structure, and who adjust their behavior accordingly. Pups and juveniles are doing something specific during this time. They are watching. Young meerkats who are too small and inexperienced to participate directly in the confrontation are positioned at the mob's rear, where they have a clear view of the confrontation, but are shielded from the cobra's reach by the bodies of adults. This is their education. Meerkat behavior is a mix of genetic predisposition and cultural learning, and the snake confrontation protocol is one of the things that young meerkats learn by observation before they learn it by participation. A pup that watches a dozen cobra confrontations before it is large enough to join one is not starting from zero when it finally takes its place in the confrontation line. It has already built an internal model of what the formation looks like, where the different role players position themselves, how the snake's behavior changes under pressure, and when to advance and when to hold position. The snake, eventually, leaves. This is almost always the outcome of these standoffs in which no physical contact has been made. the Cobra finds an angle of retreat that the mob allows, or the mob opens just enough of a gap that the snake can exit without triggering a pursuit. Once the Cobra is moving away, the mob's behavior shifts again. There is a period of heightened vigilance as the snake departs, with the sentinel tracking its movement and providing a running commentary of calls that tells the mob where it is going. Once the snake has left the area and the sentinel's calls have returned to the low-urgency watchman's song, the mob resumes foraging. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, with animals at the periphery of the confrontation resuming first and the dominant animals at the center being the last to stand down. What makes all of this work, what makes the system not break, is redundancy. The role structure of a meerkat mob is designed, through natural selection rather than conscious planning, to be resilient against individual failure. If the sentinel misses the cobra's approach, the foraging animals themselves will eventually detect it. If the initial alarm call is too soft or the caller too young and uncertain for the mob to fully commit to it, the system has mechanisms for signal amplification, where other animals add their calls and the collective signal becomes unambiguous. If the dominant female is occupied elsewhere, experienced subordinates fill her coordination role spontaneously. If key individuals are ill or absent, the system degrades gracefully rather than catastrophically, operating at reduced efficiency without collapsing entirely. This redundancy is not accidental. It is the product of millions of years of selection in an environment where any single point of failure could mean the death of everyone. The Kalahari does not offer second chances. A mob that fails to detect a threat dies. A mob that detects a threat but cannot coordinate a response dies. A mob whose sentinel system depends on one animal who gets injured dies. Every redundancy in the meerkat role system represents the ghost of a mob that lacked it, that failed where this system succeeds, that paid the evolutionary price for a social architecture that was not robust enough. The Cape Cobra is not, of course, the only predator the meerkat role system handles. The system processes aerial threats differently, terrestrial mammalian threats differently, rival mob intrusions differently, and each of these different threat types calls up different role assignments within the mob. The martial eagle encounter demonstrates this clearly. When the sentinel spots a martial eagle circling at high altitude, the alarm call it produces is the aerial predator call, and the mob's response is radically different from the snake response. Instead of converging and confronting, every animal dives for cover simultaneously. The nearest burrow entrance, the nearest dense thorn bush, the nearest crack in the ground. The mob explodes outward and downward, away from the sky and into shelter. This response is driven by pure vulnerability arithmetic. A martial eagle, which is a large bird of prey capable of killing an adult meerkat in a single strike from above, offers no possibility of confrontation. There is no formation that a meerkat mob can adopt that will deter a martial eagle. There is no collective pressure that will cause it to retreat. The eagle strikes from high speed at an angle that precludes any mob defense. The only response is concealment, and the only effective concealment is rapid, total, and simultaneous. Every animal that is still visible when the eagle commits to a strike is a potential victim. Every fraction of a second, shaved off the time between alarm and cover, is lives saved. The contrast between the aerial response and the snake response reveals the sophistication of the alarm call system. The mob is not simply responding to fear. It is decoding specific information and executing a specific protocol that is appropriate to the specific threat identified by that information. This is the difference between a simple alarm system, where one signal triggers one response, and a complex communication system, where a vocabulary of signals triggers a vocabulary of responses, each calibrated to a different situation. Rival mob encounters draw on yet another configuration of the role system. When two meerkat mobs meet at a territorial boundary, the response is neither a dive for cover retreat nor a snake confrontation approach. It is a coordinated territorial display that has its own specific behaviors, its own role assignments, and its own escalation protocols. The dominant pair takes the forward position. Adult subordinates form a visual mass behind them. Vocalizations shift to a war cry pattern that is different from both the watchman's song and the alarm calls. The mob advances as a unit toward the boundary. In most cases, the larger mob wins the confrontation without physical contact, simply by presenting a more impressive collective mass. In cases where the mobs are evenly matched, physical skirmishes may occur, and the role assignments become more specific, with larger and more dominant animals absorbing the forward combat positions, while younger and smaller animals provide support and noise from the rear. The territorial role during these rival mob encounters is one where the dominant female's authority is most directly visible. She is the one who decides whether to advance or withdraw, whether to escalate or disengage, whether a rival mob at the boundary represents a manageable intrusion or a threat serious enough to require abandoning the current foraging ground. Her decisions are based on information that she has been accumulating over years. She knows the neighboring mobs by their calls. She knows their approximate size. She knows the history of boundary interactions with each of them. She is not making these decisions randomly. She is drawing on a deep reservoir of social information that younger animals simply do not have access to. The pup-rearing system within the mob is another full expression of the role structure, and it is intimately connected to the mob's capacity to handle threats effectively. Pup-rearing in meerkats is a cooperative enterprise, unlike almost anything else in the mammalian world. When the dominant female produces a litter, she does not rear those pups alone. The entire mob contributes. The contribution takes several specific forms, each assigned to different categories of mob members. Babysitters, which are typically adults or older subadults, remain at the burrow with the pups when the mob leaves to forage, providing warmth, protection, and physical presence to deter any small predator that approaches the burrow. Provisioners, which are any mob member old enough to successfully catch prey, bring food back to the pups once they are old enough to eat solid food, making a specific food call when they arrive at the burrow that triggers a begging response from the pups. Pup escorts, which are typically one or two adults, accompany pups when they begin to move with the foraging group, positioning themselves between the pups and the direction of any potential threat. The teaching role within pup rearing is one of the most complex elements of the entire system. Meerkat adults, and particularly older adults with the most prey capture experience, have been observed actively tutoring pups in prey handling. The teaching sequence for dangerous prey, particularly scorpions, has been documented in detail and is one of the most sophisticated examples of active teaching in any non-human animal. The teacher does not simply catch prey and let the pup watch. The teacher catches prey, partially disables it to reduce its danger, and then presents it to the pup in a state that allows the pup to practice handling without fatal risk. As the pup's skill improves, the teacher presents less and less disabled prey, eventually graduating to live, fully functional scorpions that the pup must handle independently. The progression from dead prey to disabled prey to live prey is calibrated to the individual pup's developing skill, which the teacher apparently assesses through observation of the pup's handling technique. This active teaching, which is extremely rare in the animal kingdom, is made possible by the cooperative structure of the mob. An animal that was hunting alone for its own survival could not afford to bring prey to a pup and sacrifice its own meal. An animal that was the sole carer for that pup could not afford the time that teaching requires, because the time spent teaching is time not spent on all the other survival tasks that a sole carer must perform. The teaching is possible only because the cooperative structure distributes the costs of pup rearing across the whole mob, freeing specific individuals to invest the time and energy that teaching requires. The integration of all these systems, the sentinel rotation, the alarm call vocabulary, the threat-specific response protocols, the pup-rearing cooperation, the territorial defense structure, creates something that is qualitatively different from any individual behavior. It creates a collective intelligence that operates at a higher level than any individual meerkat could achieve alone. A single meerkat in the Kalahari is vulnerable to virtually everything. It cannot monitor all directions simultaneously. It cannot process threats from multiple angles at once. It cannot teach its young while defending against a cobra, while monitoring for eagles, while tracking a rival mob's position. It is simply not cognitively or physically capable of doing everything that survival in the Kalahari requires. The mob is capable of all of these things simultaneously, because the role system distributes the cognitive and physical load across multiple bodies, each performing a specialized function, each contributing information and capacity that the others cannot provide themselves. The mob is not just a group of meerkats. It is a distributed survival system in which each individual animal is a functional component, performing roles that are both necessary and irreplaceable, and in which the failure of any component triggers compensatory responses from the rest of the system that prevent the failure from cascading into catastrophe. The question of how this system is maintained over time is one of the most fascinating aspects of meerkat social biology. The system is not rigid. It is not a set of fixed behaviors that every meerkat performs identically. It is a flexible, adaptive, self-regulating architecture that responds to changes in group composition, changes in threat environment, changes in resource availability, and changes in the developmental stage of individual group members. When a mob loses members through predation, the remaining members shift their role assignments to cover the gaps. When a mob gains members through a successful breeding season, the expanded roster allows more specialized role assignments, with some animals able to focus more exclusively on certain functions rather than having to cover multiple roles simultaneously. The behavioral flexibility within the role system is maintained by a combination of individual learning, social learning from group members, and the sheer relentlessness of selection pressure in the Kalahari environment. Animals that perform their roles poorly, that miss threats as sentinels, that fail to respond appropriately to alarm calls, that do not contribute to pup provisioning, suffer fitness consequences that are often immediate and severe. The mob is not a charity. It is a cooperative enterprise in which contribution is the price of membership, and animals that consistently fail to contribute face exclusion, reduced social access, reduced mating opportunities, and in extreme cases, eviction from the group. The dominant female's role in maintaining role system integrity is particularly interesting. Subordinate females in the mob are under constant suppression of their own reproductive capacity. The dominant female uses both behavioral and chemical mechanisms to suppress ovulation in subordinate females, and she will evict pregnant subordinates from the group to prevent them from producing litters that would compete with her own for the mob's provisioning resources. This reproductive suppression is not simply cruelty or dominance display. It is functional. A mob that is simultaneously raising multiple litters from multiple females is a mob whose provisioning resources are stretched to the breaking point, whose sentinel rotation is disrupted by the demands of multiple babysitting assignments, and whose pup escort capacity is overwhelmed. The dominant female's reproductive monopoly is the mechanism that prevents the system from being overwhelmed by its own cooperativeness. The dominant male's role in system maintenance is different, but equally specific. He is the primary agent of Border Patrol, spending more time than any other individual, monitoring the territorial boundaries and responding to the presence of rover males, which are adult males from other mobs who attempt to sneak into the group and mate with subordinate females. The dominant male's vigilance against rover males is not simply about protecting his own reproductive access, though it serves that function as well. It is about maintaining the genetic coherence of the mob's pup production in a way that aligns with the dominant female's reproductive strategy. The dominant female benefits from having a dominant male who actively deters rover males, because rover males who successfully mate with subordinate females and then leave create pups that have no investment from a full-time group member, placing an additional provisioning burden on the mob without a corresponding increase in the mob's functional capacity. When we return to the Cobra confrontation with all of this context, the behavior we see is transformed from something that looks like a dramatic animal encounter into something much more. It is a demonstration of the system under maximum stress, performing at its highest level of complexity, deploying every element of the role architecture simultaneously, and doing so with a fluency that makes it look effortless. But it is not effortless. It is the product of individual lifetimes of learning, of social lifetimes of accumulated experience, of evolutionary timescales of selection pressure that has shaped every element of the system toward one end: survival in the harshest environment that Southern Africa has to offer. The sentinel who spots the cobra and gives the correct species-specific alarm call is the product of months of observational learning and weeks of active sentinel experience. The dominant female, who positions herself at the center front of the confrontation formation, is drawing on years of direct snake encounter experience. The adult male who holds the closest position to the cobra's strike zone is performing a role that his social position assigns to him and that his physical capability enables him to fill. The juveniles at the mob's rear, who watch every moment of the confrontation with absolute attention, are already building the internal model that will make them effective participants in the next one. And the sentinel, who maintains watch on the termite mound throughout the confrontation, tracking the sky and the surrounding ground while the rest of the mob faces the snake, is the embodiment of the system's core principle. No single threat is handled at the expense of vigilance against all other threats. The system never breaks because it is designed not to break, but designed is too deliberate a word for what natural selection produces. The system survives because systems that broke did not. Every ancestor of every living meerkat carried a version of this role architecture, and the mobs that survived to produce those ancestors were the mobs whose architecture was robust enough to handle whatever the Kalahari threw at them. The cobras that are alive in the Kalahari today are the descendants of cobras that never quite managed to kill these mobs off. The meerkats that are alive today are the descendants of mobs that kept their systems